in coming up to 1996 in the federal election, John Howard made a number of headland speeches, which, and he made it very clear that he wanted to take apart unionised Australia. So the 4 key areas or industries that he wanted to target in that restructuring was, and deunionisation, were mining, obviously, the meat industry, the maritime industry, and of course, maritime construction, meat and mining. So they'd already had a bit of a practice run in Weipa. You might recall there was a big dispute in Weipa, and in the late 80s, you had the Pico Balls End dispute and a number of other mining disputes. There were also, Mudgeonbury and the meat industry. So we'd had a lot of, the H.R. Nichols Society was running rampant. They'd got up and running. So we basically had a lot of forewarning. And so you'll recall that when 1996 election came around, there was a very famous meeting at the Melbourne Town Hall where Paul Keating got up and spoke, and Keating spoke, and before him, Bill Kelty said the recent skirmish in terms of Weipa is just simply the sonata, just simply one piece. If they want to fight, if they want a war, then we'll have the full symphony with all the pieces and all the clashes and all the music. It's a great quote, and people said he shouldn't have made the speech and so on, but actually for any radical person within the union movement, it was probably music to your ears, because it probably actually meant that for once the union movement was prepared to fight for something real. So I think Kelty knew that he had the Accord years, that was all over. Now the union movement was going to face the fight of its life. Where we chose to stand, I suppose, and that's why this dispute is so important, is because the MUA is clearly, if you go from 1890 in the maritime, the maritime dispute of the early 1890s, they have played a very major part in the history of the trade union movement, so hold a very dear place at the centre of it. There's only a couple of other unions that probably do. So the attack on the MUA, which was launched by Howard and obviously Peter Reith as Industrial Relations Minister, had to be met and was met. And they had planned it very carefully, clearly, just in terms of the context. Clearly, Chris Corrigan and Patrick's basically organised with the government to restructure the company to effectively create an employing company that was effectively a labour hire company, which could then effectively the contract with Patrick's proper, where the assets were all moved into, could be terminated. They'd set the groundwork very carefully over a number of months around the enterprise bargaining, saying, wharfies were lazy, they were paid $90,000 a year, container lift rates were not international standard, etc., etc. So that was kind of setting the scene, and that was one of the things I think we can talk about. How do you because message a dispute like this and any other thing you're engaged in where it involves civil disobedience, because you've got to be very careful about what your frame is for fighting the dispute. So that was kind of the dispute, was about the government wanted to restructure the waterfront. They wanted to deunionise the waterfront. They set up companies which were labour hire companies which would employ mercenaries, basically, ex-military people. They came from particular parachute brigades and SAS. They were recruited. The union got wind in November, December 1997 that they were going to go to Dubai to train, to do their training. That was sort of wrecked when Dubai withdrew the visas, but nevertheless they continued with the sort of plan. They trained them somewhere else. Then in the end of January, basically they took over WebDoc down here in Melbourne, evicted the workers, and then we had a bit of a phony war for about 6 or 8 weeks, until April the 7th or 8th, when they actually sacked all 1,700 employees of the company. And they did that by simply terminating the contract with the labour hire company that these people were all employed by. And the next day, of course, the government announced that there was going to be a redundancy fund, a levy on all the stevedores across the country to pay the $250 million in redundancy for these 1,700 workers. So as far as the government was concerned in Corrigan, these people had been sacked, they were out of work, non-union labour was on the waterfront. And and that was the beginning of about a month of activity at all levels. So, I suppose what we can talk about is that intersection between, because a lot of people say it was won in the courts. It's not my view. I think there's a whole layer of different strategies and kind of intersecting parts of the puzzle, the legal, community, media, a whole range of things that were done that ultimately brought the workers back into the workplace around about May the 6th or 8th of that year. Look, I think that was April the 7th, 8th. By the end of Easter, because a lot of people were away, including myself, it's a bit weird because we'd lived in this kind of netherworld for about 6 or 8 weeks. Had been a picket line down at Webb Dock, and that had got into some trouble because early on, one of the MUA members threw a brick through the bus window carrying the scabs, the security people, and that was a bit unfortunate. It didn't help us. So I think between then, sort of late January, early February, we'd had a bit of time to prepare. I still don't think we were that prepared. So when we got to April the 7th, April the 8th, which was actually a bit before Easter, actually Easter was the next weekend, we kind of set a picket line up at Swanson Dock. That was the main Melbourne port, and I'm sure the same happened in Adelaide and Sydney, Brisbane, Fremantle. But there wasn't much action.
And when you say we, who was we?
Well, we was the unions. It was mainly MUA members early on, from my memory, and then pretty quickly we got together because we sort of knew it was going to be the biggest thing happening for us for the next month or two. Pretty quickly, most unions were devoting a lot of their time to it. There were rosters formed, so whether they were nurses and teachers or they were ETU or NTU or whoever would have a roster. We had a committee that was cross-union that was meeting every day. At the MUA, we had subcommittees that dealt with community, police liaison, the picket line itself and the rosters around it. There's a whole group that dealt with logistics and food. And out of that, pretty much that kind of community involvement grew because we realised, I think, early on, and some of it was forced on us because a lot of the MUA people were injuncted off the picket line in pretty quick time. We knew we were going to rely on people who weren't traditional union people. I mean, there was a fair few traditional union people, but a lot of them were not union at all. They came from faith communities or, they just weren't, they were sympathetic, but they weren't union people. So I suppose that was one of the eye-openers for me, that it was, and I've been on lots of picket lines, but it was one where there was, and that was something that was built, not natural in a way, and I think it was, so this probably all happened over the course of a week, that we built that kind of infrastructure. And then gradually more and more people, as I think they realised the innate unfairness of it all, this wasn't the Australian way to simply, whatever your disagreements and whatever your views about wharfies and whether they were attractive or ugly or whatever, it wasn't the way to treat people. And especially when we started talking about impact on families, we talked about tried to shift the emphasis away from individual waterside workers to the broader ramifications of it, and what it meant for other industries.
And am I right in thinking that there was also a bit of one of the important things of having a community picket was that the unions or the MUA had to be careful about being seen to secondary boycotts and organising it directly? Was that something that was a challenge?
Absolutely. And in the end, the Port of Melbourne Authority in Melbourne went and got an injunction from the Supreme Court of Victoria that injuncted virtually the whole world from being there. And in fact, it was overturned by a full court of the Supreme Court because it was too broad. So that was at one level. So I suppose there were I think a lot of us got writs that were served on us at various points, but they had their legal strategy, and of course the union movement had its legal strategy. So virtually from Easter, the hearings from the union side started before Justice North. So that was pretty much, I think, North found in favour of the unions on the 21st of April, and then that was upheld by the full court of the Federal Court on the 23rd of April. And the High Court, the appeal from the employer to the High Court was heard and dealt with on the 4th of May. So all this happened within a 2 to 3 week kind of period, 2-week period. And it was all touch and go for a while. I mean, obviously down in Melbourne, we had a huge night with it. I must say the one helpful thing for us was the police, because the police were in their own bargaining dispute with the state government. So they weren't all that friendly to the state government. So even though they tried to bust the East Swanson dock picket a couple of times, they weren't all that serious about it. They kind of didn't come in with helmets and perspex shields. Well, it was non-violent and was meant to be non-violent, and we trained to be non-violent, so people holding each other in the picket line, not lashing out. There were occasions when we had, like, the brick through the bus window, or Neil Mitchell, the 3AW broadcaster, had the sort of audacity to bring a caravan down to the picket line to broadcast from, and someone took a swipe at him, and that didn't go down very well for a little while, and so on. So so we very much tried to be non-violent. So the whole idea was numbers, to maintain numbers. We had a very good, look, these are the days before, I can imagine, the technology now would have been a dream. We didn't have smartphones. So really you could ring a few people and ask them it was like a telephone tree, basically. That you had about probably a couple of thousand names on bits of paper, and you'd ring 100 people and ask them to get 10 people there or 15 people there. That's sort of how it rolled. So it was a bit of an effort. Once you couldn't just send an email kind of to 2,000 people. This was 1998, so it was just at the cusp of that sort of technology. Much easier now, but we had to mobilise quickly. But we were getting also, the other great thing we had was police, for example, did not want to be there, and didn't want to. So we'd get calls from wives of policemen saying, "Oh, they're mobilising tonight. They've been called to go to the bus in Dandenong to get on the bus, at 10 o'clock." So we would get this information and be able to mobilise 500 people or 1,000 people and keep them there overnight, until we thought there was no risk anymore. But so that was pretty good. By and large, I think the view of the MUA was twofold: to keep their own members working in other companies, so that they couldn't be accused of stopping the whole country, and secondly, they would have other people to fund the people who were the 1,700 who they expected to be on the picket line.
Quite critical, wasn't it, with P&O, the other main company? There were two main stevedoring countries, Patrick and their labour hire mob, and P&O. And as I understand it, the union deliberately did not strike. The P&O workers did not strike.
No, absolutely. And other workers were asked to contribute money. There were levies of other unions, and that millions of dollars. I mean, if you looked at the amount that went into that dispute, it was enormous in terms of the amount of money, and really that was the sort of discipline of it. I think to be fair to Kelty and Coombs, they were right to say this is where the battle is, and we've got to win this battle. We're not about a revolution. We're about making sure we maintain a union on the picket line. On the wharves with Patrick's. Now people can be critical of the outcome. There were concessions made, and all kinds of things happened in what ended up being the settlement of the dispute. But by and large, it was successful in blunting that attack, de-unionising the wharves. And if they'd got their way there, it would have cascaded through the maritime industry generally, the logistics industry, and then the other industries, construction, mining, etc. So I think the discipline side of it and focusing on Patrick's was the right call.
Actually, I was reading Greg Combay's book on it in preparation for this, and it wasn't just on that; it was on his struggles as a union official, etc. And one of the things that amazed me there was that apparently on that, just before Easter, the company sent redundancy payments by cheque to all the homes of the maritime workers, and none of them were cashed. It was $20 million. None of them were cashed. They were hoping that they would just cash in, and then they'd say, well, they'd accept the redundancy. So, I mean, that was just one little element of it. But I thought that was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
There was such unity.
That element of discipline was pretty amazing. You're right. And that's why I suppose the MUA has always been regarded as, a core part of the trade union movement in Australia, because they've had that discipline for, they did it tough in the 30s and, with, what do you call it, the lining up for work, and they busted that, the Dog Collar Act and all that sort of stuff. They busted that. So they were a pretty tough union. And so they were the one union that I think Kelty thought, he could back, that they would be trusted to hold that discipline. I must say the solidarity, I must say one of my regrets of that dispute was that we didn't carry that through post the MUA dispute. So if you thought about the amount of money that was directed to one thing, if the union movement had done that every year, put so many $1 million into one campaign or one thing, it's always so much more powerful than 20 unions spending $100,000 on some piddly little campaign that's not necessarily going to go anywhere. And I think one of the great regrets I had was that we didn't learn that lesson of combining our forces to fight a particular campaign. I think Your Rights at Work was the other example of unions doing that in 2006-07, but beyond that, we haven't really learned that lesson very well. Well, I think we always look in every dispute. I mean, in my 10 years at Trades Hall, and then before that and after that, we would always had look, if someone's going to beat you over the head, you're better off knowing when that's going to happen, I think, unless you want an element of surprise. But generally, you get a better outcome. I mean, I remember one dispute where we had workers locked in a factory out in Yarraville. It was ACI Glass. And about 20 or 30 ETU members, maybe not 20, maybe 15, had locked themselves in a building. They were in there for a week or 8 days, I think. And it was a pretty critical part of the factory. So the factory was getting pretty desperate. And beer was about to run out because bottles couldn't be made. But the police, we knew that we couldn't last forever. And we had a picket line there. And eventually that liaison with the police, it almost broke the company. We knew that we couldn't, but we engineered with the police when those workers would come out and how they would come out and what the message that we could get out of that would be. So that relationship with the police was very important. And that's my experience look, sometimes you just can't help it. police are going to have to do what they're going to have to do. That's how it is. But you're better off having a relationship and knowing them. And I think I think you're right in both things. Many times there are people who could live down the street. Every family, every big Catholic family had a priest, a policeman, and a nurse and a teacher or whatever. They could be any one of us. And I think having that relationship, and a lot of them in the MUA dispute saw that it was wrong, and didn't put their heart and soul into it. I'm sure about that. So, I mean, tactically, I just can't see the sense in not having a relationship, because that then just, you've got to sow doubt in their mind, and you've got to show, if you believe you're reasonable people the right is on your side, then I think having a relationship is the right thing to do. It doesn't have to bow to them. That's not to say you give in, but it helps you, I think, ultimately manage stuff. And there's lots of stuff to manage. No, not early on. I think the MUA members, basically there was always an organiser there. They'd been drilled by John Coombs and others that there couldn't be any violence, and that was about it, really. Training only really came into play when we started to get hundreds of people, and then we would have kind of had a system from memory where, new people down there, there'd be an hour kind of a training in sort of non-violent sort of, how to sit on the ground, how to hold each other, whatever, that sort of training. And it was pretty limited. It wasn't theoretical. It was just kind of, don't be provoked, and this is the hardest way for someone to drag you off to a divvy van. Basically, that's really all it amounted to. So, yeah, a lot of it really relied on the goodwill of people who went down there. There wasn't a lot of training. There were some people. Look, we did get, in fact, some of the people who came down and provided food. I remember there was a group called, I think, Food Not Bombs, something like that. They came and they set up a kitchen. That was fantastic. They cooked every day for probably a couple of hundred people. It was a big operation. So we had this mix of, the partners of maritime workers working with these Food Not Bombs people, and they'd brought their own sort of philosophy with them, and that part of that was non-violence, and they'd been around the environment movement and the peace movement. So it was a real mixture. So it was new for a lot of the union people. Remember, something like this that goes for a month wasn't, even in union terms, we've had a few lately, like Carlton United Breweries here in Melbourne, or it's a few others, but there weren't a lot that went for that long. If a dispute went for a week, that was a long dispute, I don't know about John's experience, but that's my experience. Most disputes don't go that long. So, so training wasn't a huge feature. Yeah, there was some, but not much. Yeah, and to be honest, I think we'd probably be kidding ourselves that. I mean, we did a lot of work. I mean, we went and spoke at hundreds of meetings, churches, migrant, groups, the Greek community, the Italian community, all kinds of groups. But I think there was something about Peter Reith and John Howard that sort of did inspire people to do good rather than to act. I remember getting in the car at Trades Hall, and some of these couple of women were there and wanting a lift down to the picket line. So I gave them a lift down. When I got them in the car, I said, "Oh, where do you come from?" And they were both teachers at very fancy private Melbourne schools, girls' schools. One was, I think, they might have been both Presbyterian Ladies College or whatever. And neither of them, I don't think, were members of the union. They just wanted to go down there because they thought what was happening was wrong. It had crossed a line. And I think that was the great thing about that dispute, that the ordinary Australian, by the end of it, 60 or 70% of people thought it was simply wrong to sack people in that way. and restructure a company, just with the purpose of ending people's employment. And I just think that really did the government a lot of damage. They still lasted another 7 or 8 years, but yeah, I did them a lot of damage, and I think it did them in the dispute a lot of damage. I think, you know, the balaclava images, the kind of secrecy, sending people to Dubai, it's just not very Australian, is it? So yeah, but I agree with you, how we relate to the community. And I think you have to do that on each community. That's where maybe it's a lesson. The union movement has a dogma, it has its own way of speaking to people. And sometimes if you go to a faith community, you've got to somehow couch it in terms of their values, you know, around whatever it is in the Gospels that is about, you know, people reaching out and helping those who are downtrodden, you know, or you can sort of, I think we've got to learn to couch these things in ways that those different communities, whatever they are, can understand it. Yeah. You could be right. And the other thing, of course, remembering in 1998, people didn't necessarily have social media. So their one source of truth was the kind of nightly TV or the ABC or the radio or whatever. And it was much like these days, people are in their own bubble. They get their own news feed. They get what they want according to their preferences. It's much harder to influence people now. And I think, isn't that the sort of, as I read it, that's part of the lesson about the danger of social media. Yes, it's a wonderfully democratic platform, but a lot of these people are trapped in a bubble of their own reflection. And it would be much harder now to get that message out about what the MUA dispute was to people, I think, in the age of social media. I think that's part of the problem. I mean, I say that's where I suppose I have a bit of a thing about privacy. I've never assumed that anything I've done in my life or anything of importance in the trade union movement was secret. And I think we had to assume that a lot of what we did would be public knowledge or would be known about. Now, whether agents provocateurs kind of, don't think we particularly feared that. I mean, I think most of the public relations disasters we had were of our own making. Like, you know, you might recall the children in the picket line up in Sydney. The media made a lot of play with that, where children were being kind of put at the front of the picket line, so they were dragged away and there was ugly scenes and that sort of stuff we had to manage. And then we had to, I don't think we had anything, no fears about spies particularly, because we just assumed that, you know, probably there was going to be somebody. So no one said anything. Yeah, we just went about our business, really. Yeah. No. I mean, I know in Melbourne, there was nothing truck-wise. There was nothing went in and out. We got into a lot of trouble one day trying to dig up some railway lines because they were trying to get a train load of stuff into Appleton Dock, which is next door to Webb Dock. And we actually had a couple of old grannies, they'd hate me for saying that, but they stood on the railway line with about 60 women further up the line, and we were trying to dislodge some rails further down the line. But that sort of stuff happened. That we had built and welded together. Some of our more artistic people had made a sculpture out of railways, lengths of rail, and that was pretty formidable. It was a lattice went to about 1 metre and a bit high, and was probably about 10 metres across of railway line. Eventually, the police said, "Well, you'll have to move that." So it was one of our little bargaining chips we moved that, they wouldn't bust us at one point. So eventually that went, but that was probably for the first week and a half. That was a bit of but no, generally in Melbourne, and Melbourne was, I don't want to sort of, not to say all the other picket lines weren't important, they were, but Melbourne at that time, it's not the case anymore, but containerisation in and out of Melbourne, I think was at that time around 40 or 50% of the whole of the country. Was the biggest port by far, and much bigger than Botany. And so it's not the case anymore, but I remember during that dispute that a lot of the other premiers, in terms of holding off their police force, were watching Melbourne very closely, because if the police had busted it here and so on, and because I remember getting Bob Carr ringing me, and I was a nobody, I was Secretary of the Trades Hall Council, but 2 or 3 times during a 2 or 3 week period, I had Bob Carr on the phone saying, "What's happening? Are you going to be able to hold the picket line?" Because he'd been under enormous pressure from the less civilised press in Sydney to kind of send the police through it. So he was trying to bat this back, and he was desperate to know whether or not it would hold. So I think
he was Premier at the time, was he?
Yeah, Premier at the time. Yeah. So I think there was the picket lines weren't just for show; they were really important. And there was a cavalcade organised by the Farmers Federation of oranges and other stuff from the Goulburn Valley. About 10 or 12 trucks that tried to come through another gate. I remember down at a side sort of gate away from Swanson Dock. And that was a pretty ferocious battle to stop those trucks with cars and bodies on the road and all that sort of stuff. So it was about stopping Patrick's, but saying to people, you're welcome to go, and as you said before, you're welcome to go and use their competitors. If you use their competitors. And there's that story of the ship. You'll recall that wonderful story of the ship that came from, was loaded in, which port was it? Was it in Melbourne or Sydney? Went to San Francisco, Los Angeles. They refused to unload it, and it came all the way back with the same load to be unloaded. They said the only way we'll unload this is if it comes back having been loaded by union labour. And I must say that was my first taste of international stuff as well. We organised with some union comrades in LA to do some stuff at the US consulate there with American dock workers and others. And so there was a lot of that kind of cooperation as well. I mean, obviously the ITF played a major role in organising all of that. So it was pretty full on, I think, in terms of the impact. So impact on particularly a lot of exporters who used those shipping lines that Patrick's loaded. So I suppose my take on the MUA dispute was basically that if we combine both our effort and our resources, we're pretty powerful. I think the other thing was it wasn't one strategy. As I said at the start, a lot of people thought it was the legal strategy, but I think, to be honest about it, the community involvement and the community picket lines and the sort of mobilisation of public opinion was, so the media effort in turning it away from just being about these wealthy wharfies into what's fair and reasonable in Australian society and what sort of country do we want to live in, that was really important. The other thing is and I don't know whether this is something for Extinction Rebellion to think about, is that dispute started from, and the whole civil disobedience started from something that was very mainstream. So, I mean, like, it wasn't sort of, I don't know how to express it, but it was a very mainstream dispute. I've been in a number of disputes that are on the edge. They might be power workers who shut off the power at a power station without any notice, or something, other kinds of disputes that have. I was in the plumbers union when we tried to break the prices and incomes accord back in about '85, and we got splattered by Kelty and Hawke and the Industrial Relations Committee to find what is now the equivalent of millions of dollars. So I've been on the receiving end of it, but so what really succeeded about this dispute, I think, was that it was so mainstream. It was not on the margin, it was at the very core of the labour movement. So I suppose there's a bit of a lesson there in saying, well, if it's like environment, how do we make whatever the thing we're going to do be at the core of what your average Joe out there is thinking about? So I don't know how you draw that comparison. And the other thing is that I suppose I learn out of it a bit, and it's attached to that, is that Australian sentiment, and it's both a great thing about Australia and a real weakness, unlike France, where you can mobilise, you've only got 10% unionisation, but you can mobilise 1 million workers in a demonstration. People are very passionate and very... Australians tend to be in the middle, so they don't particularly like the radical right. I think that's why the radical right hasn't, until probably more recently, found a home in Australia. But not, on the other hand, nor do they like extremes of the other side as well. So to me, they don't like unfairness or taking advantage of people, and they don't like government that overplays its hand. And I think that was one thing in the MUA dispute. We had a government that overplayed its hand and was seen to be, nasty and conniving, basically. So, yeah.